Thank you so much. So the issue I'm working on is trying to figure out when there is like a screen when you are creating works. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So I just got a call and it always switches from my headphones to switches my headphones to my phone. So anyway, so there is a screen when we are creating a workspace that the user needs to choose from which agent and hence which cluster they will use for the for creating the workspace. That's the issue. About I was fiddling with the GraphQL queries for getting agents for a group and for a project and trying to figure out and describe how I think those works. So I've done that here, and then I assumed that the GraphQL endpoints already give us more or less what we need. And then here Victor corrected me when I said that I think that like the cluster was mainly available to that project that defined the agent. So I called it infrastructure project, but it's the project that contains the .gitlab/ cluster. I think it is like the configuration of the of all the agents.
GitLab's agent name config.
Yeah,
we call it configuration project. In
configuration
docs,
project,
especially in the docs, it's called configuration project everywhere.
Okay, thanks. I'll rename it everywhere from infrastructure project here to configuration project. And so originally I thought that that's the only project or the main project that has access to the cluster, and because I saw some videos where Victor was showing GitOps, how the Kubernetes resources were put into the configuration project and how they were provisioned in the cluster. But I was wrong, and there is a I was looking through documentation of go away Zoom. Let's go away. Here when we are configuring the access for CI, and that's something that I'm going to ask you about because I don't know much about it. But so that was one thing where I was wrong. Like there is already a mechanism to access the projects, like to give other projects kind of relationship or access to the configuration project and to the cluster. And then another part that seems to be tough is to figure out what agents are available to a user. And that's something where I'm not clear about. It's probably the main thing that I wanted to call you about and or talk to you about. And so maybe if we could talk about how currently CI is connected to the cluster, that would be really useful. Like if we have an overview, I looked at the documentation, but I didn't have that much time since I read this in the morning. So that would be one thing. And second thing would be just what's the difference between a project having an access to an agent and a user having access to a project. Sorry, user having access to an agent.
So the data that we work with is configuration in the agent's configuration file. There is no stuff in the database as a source of truth, basically. So based on that, we kind of have to figure out what is allowed. And that means the agent owner grants access to the agent to some projects or groups. And then when CAS, the server for the agent, reads configuration for that agent, it sends it to Rails. And then Rails builds indices based on the configuration file, based on what is allowed in that configuration file. This is described in the CI access file, this file, yes. Somewhere.
So this is the CI access. This is
yeah. scroll a bit more. This is like
identifiers, authentication, authorization, default
so
configuration.
notifying GitLab of agents configuration. That's the thing I'm talking about. So basically, we have agent to project ID and agent to group ID in the configuration file. But in the database, we want the opposite index from project to agent to a list of agents.
Yes.
So it's many to many, and then from groups to agents as well, many to many. Two lookup tables, at least two. I don't know actually how it is implemented, but
okay, I understand.
The logic
so
is
like what one configuration project, like if there is a agent A, let's say, defined in configuration project, we can assign it to arbitrary number of projects and groups and it's all configured in that agent name config YAML, like in the configuration project. Okay.
So
yeah,
Rails builds and updates those index tables when it gets configuration for an agent, and then it uses them in the allowed agents API when CAS calls that API with a CI job token to figure out what agents this CI job can access. So
can you repeat the last bit? So when Rails knows about, like, Rails updates the configuration, like from this YAML file, and then
yes, so it updates the index tables in the database. That's it. That's all it does when it's called with the configuration file. It doesn't need to do anything else. Then Rails also exposes the allowed agents API, which is described just below, and it is called by CAS. Yes, this endpoint. It's called by CAS every time it gets a request to proxy, Kubernetes API request to proxy, to understand whether this agent with this CI token can be accessed by this with this job. So first, Rails does authentication to understand if the CI job token is even valid. Then obviously after that's done, we know the CI project ID, so we know what project runs a CI job. So we have that project ID, and then by that project ID, we can find all the agents that are allowed to be accessed from that project, and groups as well. Like we look at where project is in which groups, and we can traverse that up in a hierarchy.
Okay.
And then there's an algorithm of how merging works. So the most specific configuration wins, and that's it. We have the configuration basically. Then we have a list of agents that can be accessed from this CI job, each with configuration for that agent, for that project, more specific configuration. And that is returned by this API. And then CAS picks from that list, it picks the agent, the configuration for the agent that is selected by the user, because in the CI job there may be multiple agents that are available, and that's why user needs to pick one agent. That's done by kubectl config set context or use context, I think. And yeah, that's how CI job picks the cluster to talk to, basically.
So CAS is calling this this API. How does CAS know that there is even a new job? I would assume that the direction goes or like CAS is polling for new jobs from CI. Is that's no?
CAS is just an HTTP reverse proxy to the outside world, and it gets requests from CI job.
So when let's say a new job is created, And so Rails knows about it because there is some push. Let's say that there was like a push to repo, so we have hooks that listen on that push. Rails realizes, okay, I need to trigger a pipeline. This is going to be comprised of these jobs, and then it's strange to like the part I don't understand is that something should be calling the Rails API was in my mind only Rails knows about that there is now 5 jobs that need to be scheduled on some CI runners. And
So
how the
at that stage, Cas doesn't know about anything. It never knows about anything unless it is called by code that is being executed in the CI job. It's code that in the CI job that calls Cas, like user runs kubectl or Helm or whatever, and that job gets a file injected with credentials, and that is described just above.
Okay. So I misunderstood. This is not about like us provisioning CI runners in the cluster. It's about the CI controlling like deployments of I don't know, some resources. Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, that makes sense. The better sense. Okay. Now I guess I'll read up on that more. Maybe I'll still ask you, but the more pressing now issue for me is to and maybe do you know about these GraphQL endpoints that are giving you the agents for? It's probably just the logic that you described, right? Giving you agents for
that's
a
not
group
clear.
and
I don't know what it is returning actually.
Okay. Because
Because
it's also depending on the user. This is for different users. It gives you different responses.
well, this may be a list of agents that are registered in those groups. I don't know what this endpoint does. I assume it's just a list of agents that are registered in those groups, and not everybody can see them. Like it depends on your level, your role. Sorry,
On
the right word.
developer
Yeah,
or higher can see it. Yes,
yeah.
that's
So
that's
why.
what I found as well when I was looking at those. And so what is the the part that I don't understand now is like if you are a developer in a project or in a group, you could find like developer role. You have developer permissions in that project. You could find what agents are configured for that project or group, and then I didn't understand Victor's comment that was saying that like deciding which user can see the agent is a difficult problem because I would think that all users with developer access in that project can access the agent that is configured for that project. I know, well, I'll start drawing because I'm not too. So we have there is a agent.
I think what he was
like
talking about is finding all the agents in all the groups on the instance level. The comment that he linked to, I think it was about instance level.
This comment.
Oh, this comment, yes. So top level dashboard. Top level, I understood it as like
Right.
yeah.
Okay. So I understand. So if you would want to have like all agents that are available to you on the instance, you would have to like find all the projects and groups that you are a member of and do query for all of them to figure out the Okay. So that's not our issue. We will at the worst level, like the largest level, we are going to be looking for agents for a group always. Like so okay.
Which
And
should
does
be
it
okay, yeah, because it's an indexed lookup in a many-to-many table. So it's fine. I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's what it is.
But it sounds doable. It doesn't sound as like having such a performance issue, like doing instance wide search, which we are not planning on doing. And okay, so I understand that. I understand this. So does it? like just on a high level, does it sound like reasonable to you that if you are like at least at the beginning, if you are a developer have a developer role in a project, that we would just show you all the agents that are configured for that project and allow you to provision workspaces there. Of course, this is just the initial version. Eventually, you would probably want to have some clusters where you can provision workspaces and some clusters when you can't provision workspaces, and you would want to give those agent case some kind of configuration saying like this is okay for workspace, like workspace is enabled pretty much, and we would like to query that in a database. But at the beginning, it sounds like from permission perspective, it would be okay, just give you all agents configured for the particular project.
In that very project, you mean? So the configuration project.
In any project, like if you in any project, not configuration project, but if you link an agent, let's say I have a project, this GitLab or GitLab, and in my configuration, I'm going to say that agent A is like linked to this project, same way as the CI does it. So there would be, I guess, but that's only for CI access. And this is this table specific to CI in a database in.
Yes, currently that's how. Yeah, and we also have another one which is user access, which is another section which does the same thing, kind of not. So it is not actually the same because configuration is different for different features, and user may want to enable some features for some projects, but not everything. That's why it's separate. They are separate. They are not a single thing. I allow everything to this project because maybe that's not what you want. I don't know. So far, that's what we've been doing.
So it would be like a workspace access, something like that. We would have to, or remote development access,
something like that.
But then
remote development.
Yeah, and then it's like I think that how it's been like the mental model that was around the agent right now was a little bit more constrained. Like you were really cherry picking which project like can have a CI job that deploys to your cluster, and it would be very like a smaller number of projects. Whilst with the workspaces, I assume that it's going to be more of the like a CI runner style, which is I'll show you the pictures. It's like you just have a list of these are runners configured here that you can then just assign to projects. And I would assume that you have a list of agents or the clusters that are configured that you can create workspaces in there. And then you would be just saying like hundreds of my projects can create workspaces in there, and it's going to be like inherited from the group, for example, same as runners are. So when you are creating a new project, you don't have to go and update the the agent configuration in the configuration project to add additional project. I create just a new project A, and it would directly inherit the group agents as it's happening right now with CI, or I would somewhere like click and edit that particular agent. But for starters, it would be probably inheriting from a group. Am I talking nonsense? I think like I'm still freestyling with figuring out the business logic, but does it make sense what I said, like about us being like, I guess the requirement is going to be adding new projects without having to change the agent configuration in the YAML file.
Adding where? Like adding to what?
Like adding the possibility, like I'll show you here. So like, let's say you have this agent and you have a group, and you would have like these two projects already existing, A and B, and then there would be the configuration project, let's say. Configuration. And so the way how it is now, like if we were replicating the CI configuration, we would have to have a here specifying like project A can create workspaces and project B can create workspaces. That's what you configure into the YAML. And then what I'm saying the requirement would be ideally is that when you create a new project C, you don't have to go and make a commit in here. So we would instead, I guess we could have a like group. This group can create workspaces and all the projects that are within it can create workspaces, something like that.
So first of all, config project doesn't have to be under this group. And second, yeah, just grant access to the group and that's it. Then you don't have to don't have to edit the config file if you want to create a new project in this group. And yeah, this is how CI access works in user access as well. So I'm suggesting you do the same thing basically, just with your specific configuration, if there is anything.
Understand. And when do you know what the user access is for? Is it for the dashboard?
It's for dashboard, and we will probably use it for other future features as well, where we are thinking maybe generating access configuration files for kubectl so that people can run local tools on their computer against their cluster via GitLab, like using GitLab authentication. Something like that.
Okay. So like the local kubectl command would be proxying through GitLab to their cluster. That's what
like CI job does, like the same thing. Just yeah, this is for authentication basically. And
but it
not only authentication, it's also proxying because they may not have direct access to the cluster from their laptop. Yeah, so cluster is in the cloud behind the firewall, but there's an agent in the cluster connected to GitLab. So you can access the cluster from CI, from your laptop, from the browser for dashboarding. Maybe I really hope we will have a terminal in the browser feature at some point. Yeah, that's why it's proxy, not just authentication via, via a call and then direct access to the cluster, because yeah, the cluster can be not accessible directly from the machine.
Ideally, it probably isn't directly accessible, right? That would be understand. So, but that seems like that is mainly like the user access is mainly targeted at administrators or like the people who have access to the cluster, usually who would want to see the dashboards or change something in the cluster. That it sounds like that's not going to be a feature for the users of the workspaces.
Not necessarily. Maybe so the mental model that we always had is that there is one use case, I guess, and a big use case is there's a team, one or more separate engineers who manage the cluster. They own the agent and agent's configuration, and then there is a separate team, likely multiple teams, which need access to the cluster, but they don't manage the cluster. They are just given, let's say, access to a namespace or maybe several namespaces, and they work within those namespaces. So agent owner grants access to developers but the restricted access, they probably don't overlap. Some maybe overlap depending on, whatever business requirements. So those people may need, want, and require access to the cluster just to look at their own stuff and maybe even modify things there as well.
Okay. That makes good sense. Maybe that would be a future feature that we would be thinking about, like that you could use your workspace to change something in a cluster, like your remote development workspace. But I think that for the initial version, at least, I would be pretty content with the workspaces being completely disconnected from the cluster, and so you don't need the user access at the beginning, like it would be.
Yeah, I think these features should be separate because they're mostly for different purposes. User access is to
manage the cluster somehow, or
UI access, terminal access, that kind of thing, and workspaces is for workspaces. So I think under the hood they may even use something the same thing, like some code and whatever, but conceptually they are separate things.
Can I know I said half an hour and we are reaching that point, but I have two things. I would like to try to wrap my head, because I would try to wrap my head around the CI, how we now allow like a CI job to deploy something to a cluster. So I would try to draw it and you would just correct me on a really high level. So I have a pointers when I'm going through the documentation. I already know what kind of to look for. That would be one thing. And then I have like 3 questions somewhere here that I would like to run past you and figure out whether I can get anything newer. So maybe I'll start with the drawing here. And so we have I know that we have a cast somewhere here. It's not in the group, so it's like here. But I'm mainly interested in the part of the agent that runs in the cluster. So there is this is a cluster, and here we would have I guess a deployment that we want to work with. And now when we are starting there is a CI runner here, CI runner, and let's say we have it configured as we mentioned here. We mentioned, I'll make it smaller. We mentioned here that project A can't, and it would be not can create workspaces, but can is it, what would be the right word, deploy to cluster, or would it be about like manipulate?
The feature is called CI access. So access. It's for anything, any access you can.
Okay.
Depends on what the agent owner, allowed. Basically, depends
what
on
would be
permissions.
Examples. What would be examples of the read and write? I assume, and to some namespaces, or is it not namespace based? It's just whole cluster.
So it's just based on airbag. Plus, I think we do filtering by environments. So yeah, if there's a limitation for environment tier, like production environments only, let's say, or staging, then that is also taken into account. It's not described I think it's not described in that document because it was implemented later, but maybe it was added to the document as well. It should be in the user documentation though.
Okay.
But yeah, it's whatever airbag allows basically. So if airbag allows to create namespaces, then you can create namespace. You don't have to, but you can. And anything else.
Okay. And airbag is some kind of a
role-based access control that it's a way to set authorization in Kubernetes.
Okay. Understand. So you define like the permissions, you define them in Airbag that you can, I'm trying to figure out what is the difference between the configuration that we are setting up in the configuration project, and then how are we matching it with the actual permissions to manipulate the cluster? Like, is it here we say?
No, here we only say that this agent can be accessed from that project or from that group, and then that environment thing, but let's forget about it for a second. And then it's in the cluster that is that we do, not we, Kubernetes does authorization. So it checks the identity of the agent and sees if it is allowed to perform an action that it's trying to perform. On top of that, in that configuration project, we can say we can agent owner can configure the agent to impersonate an identity so that agent accesses Kubernetes API as some identity. So it's all described in the docs as well. This doc plus user documentation.
I think thank you for being patient with me in this. I know it's like I have very basic questions, but you just explained it really well to me. This part I didn't understand that. So like you have pretty much one role per agent, and that is defined somewhere in the Kubernetes cluster. As you said, the Airbag defines this agent has these and these permissions to do with the cluster, and this config only says these projects or groups are matched with the agent. But what the agent can do is not defined on a GitLab side. It's defined somewhere in the Kubernetes cluster, which that makes good sense. And that probably answers one of the questions, sorry for skipping, that might answer the question, what does it mean to have multiple agents in the same cluster? I didn't understand why would you need it, but now I think the main reason for it would be that you would want to have like read-only agent, and you would want to have a write agent, and you want to have different projects and different people being able to access them. That's probably the main reason why you would have like two agents in the same cluster, right?
You may also want to have an agent per namespace, like each team runs their own agent with permissions limited, scoped to this particular namespace.
Understand.
Like if cluster owners just give you access to this namespace and nothing else, only this, and then you can run your agent there, and it should still be able to do anything in that namespace as long as it has permissions.
That makes good sense as well.
Maybe not one namespace, like we always say a namespace, but it can be whatever, 2 namespaces, 3, 10. Maybe you have actually dynamic control. Maybe you have some sort of policy that is checked on each API request that just sees, checks that the namespace you're accessing conforms to some
matches
pattern,
some condition,
whatever, just any policy enforcement. And so it's all totally up to the people who set up your cluster. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else.
Understand. And so now if I go through the scenario of creating a, let's say, changing a deployment, so there is a newer version of an app, I'm changing the Docker image in a pod. So it would be, I commit to a project A, let's say, because project A can access the cluster. Then GitLab picks it up and sends the job to a CI runner. There is going to be a job here, like the final job is going to be deploy, something like that. Deploy. And this job is going to try to access the agent. And this is the part where you can probably help me just by saying what are the steps.
So Rails, first thing, Rails injects a configuration file into the CI job. Into each CI job. I think there's also filtering for environments. That's where it happens. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter for this conversation. So that config file contains credentials which are CI job token, so not a new kind of token, not new credentials. We don't extend any APIs with new tokens here. So there may be more than one, there may be 0 more. So depends on how many agents this job can access. And this is where those tables are used, as well as allowed agents API. So CI job can ignore this file, of course, or it can use, let's say, kubectl to access those agents. It picks one. It can use multiple, first this one, then that one, whatever, right? Can use them concurrently if it wants to, up to your job script. Then the URL that is used is the CAS URL. So in GitLab.com deployment, it's cas.gitlab.com. And what is sent is the ID of the agent. It's just a number plus the token in the authorization HTTP header. This is all documented as well in that CI access document, I think. Then CAS calls that allowed agents API call, API endpoint, and CAS Rails checks those tables, figures out if it's okay or not, and returns a list of what this CI job token can access.
That makes perfect sense, I think.
Yeah. Then CAS picks the one in the list that is requested by the user, which is just a number. The user cannot pick anything that is not allowed, of course. And then CAS, if everything's fine, CAS optionally, well, together with that list for each agent, CAS gets configuration for this agent from the config. So here, user can configure that impersonation mechanism to make agent K act as some other identity, as long as it has permissions to impersonate that identity, which is also configured in the cluster via airbag. So then, yeah, CAS proxies the request along with information about the identity agent K should impersonate for this particular request. Yeah, agent K makes the request to Kubernetes API and performs that request basically, and that's it.
Yeah, it makes sense. So it goes like this. Okay, that I didn't know. I actually had no idea that CAS is publicly available to be called, and it has a public IP address. I didn't know that.
Well, yes. Well, it doesn't. It's accessed via load balancer, but also agents are connected to it as well. So, yeah.
It makes sense that it has to, because some customers clusters are connecting to it. Okay, so this makes sense. Thanks for explaining it. I think that we kind of discussed this at length, the question of that there is the configuration project, and it is definitely okay reusing the agent for other projects and groups. We just discussed how CI does that. We just need to define how what kind of policy we are going to implement for the workspaces. Now this is explained. I think, how hard would it be to create projectless workspace? It's okay. As long as there is a group for that workspace, we would use the group configuration. That's something that we are looking at doing maybe a little bit later, to create workspaces that are not connected to any particular project. They are just under a group.
Concept of how the namespaces in Rails, right?
Yes, namespaces.
So
not groups, but namespaces.
So yeah, something like that, and then your thing can. Anyway, yes. Doable.
Okay, and we answered this. I think would be it sounds like it's okay that if we design the policy in a way that developers, like programmers with developer or users with developer access, can create workspaces in the clusters if the agent defined it in their, if this config project said that project A can create workspaces, then it's perfectly fine that people who have developer access to project A can create workspaces. Like, then it doesn't need to be any special user mapping. It can be based on the roles in the project. So everyone who would have a developer role in this project would be able to create the workspace. That sounds like a reasonable policy.
You maybe, I don't know if it makes sense or is needed, but you maybe could allow to customize this so that it's not necessarily a developer, maybe a maintainer or owner even, via agent configuration as well.
Okay, understand. That makes sense. Maybe like here, I'm not sure whether like there would be, since the workspaces are not supposed to have really, like they are supposed to be for developers, and they are not privileged in a way that they would, I don't know, have access to change the cluster or change some resource. So I'm not sure whether there is, but it's definitely something that we will consider.
Yeah, I'm just saying
it's possible.
Technically possible.
It's possible, yeah.
Then it's product decision.
And the last part that I'm kind of confused now about I know you said that you don't know where the GraphQL query comes from, but the only way how we now assign agents with groups is with the CI configuration
it may list all the projects under the group and then get all the like double join, get all the agents. So I don't know what this API does, right?
It's possible that it doesn't have anything to do with the config, with the YAML configuration.
So I guess have a look at the code or have a look at the docs for this API. I don't know what it does.
Okay. And if do you think there would be any issue with initially using this simplified method of finding an agent, that it would be just like find, like we would take a group, look for all configuration projects within that group and pick all agents defined there. And that is what we would offer to the user to create workspaces in. And it wouldn't be like the full production version, but we would just start, like, for example, when we are doing the GitLab closed, like GitLab closed, I don't know how it's called, like beta of the product, of the workspaces, of the feature, that we would simplify it before we implement this role, like this configuration for workspaces, that we would simplify it to just pick any agent that's defined under that group. Does that ring some like a bell? That's not. Does it? Do you have any red lights or like does it sound dangerous to do it that way at the very initial stage before we go and implement this, including the Rails part where we will have the lookup tables to find out what agents support what projects?
That may be a slow API query, actually. Slow database query, sorry. Because you need to list all the groups
projects
recursively. And then in each group, you need to find all the projects. Then in all projects, you need to find all the agents. That's a lot of nested queries, I think. Or a recursive query or something like that. So I think that's just slow. But also, I mean, that's just too wide of an access kind of. And just thinking about GitLab.org, sorry, not dot, GitLab.org. This
org.
Yeah, and like imagine going there and trying to create a namespace and workspace, and it's going to perform that
list
query,
all the,
and it will be slow and load the database and that everything. So I think what we did instead is kind of the opposite. just allow creating workspaces in the configuration project. And then it's kind of okay. You can
That
enable
makes
it in that project, or maybe even not enable it. Maybe it's so the thing with on by default, we discussed that in some comment somewhere. I think it can't be on by default unless it's doing an efficient polling. And it's not doing an efficient polling because it's not doing it yet. So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
either off by default or it's doing efficient polling. I think we just can't do something else. There's no third option, I think. Don't see it, at least.
yeah. Like it would
Because
be off if the feature
it's,
of remote development would be off by default on all agents unless you turn it on. I think that's what we are definitely planning on.
yeah. So then
Doing.
you need to turn it on in a project, and then yeah, you have to have it in the database, or you have to get configuration files from and parse them, which is worse than just having this in database. And
Yeah,
in any case, that's work. So why not do the right thing if it's actually not less work to do something
I
else?
understand what you're saying. So at the like, if we want to test this without like before we implement this access configuration, we can probably do it by creating workspaces for the configuration project. But anything more than that, like any other project, we already will have to have this like map the agents with a projects by using configuration similar to the CI configuration, because otherwise, as you described, if it's off by default, even if we list all the agents, we wouldn't know whether the agents probably don't support this particular feature. And then we would what would we do? Try to make the call and it would fail, or like we wouldn't have a way to limit the list of agents to only the ones that are supporting the feature anyway, unless we are already creating a configuration specific to remote development.
I mean, so first of all, so even if we limit this just to the configuration project, this will still we would still need configuration because it's off by default, right? This feature is off by default. So how would agent and CAS know that it needs to check the for workspaces? Because CAS agent K is polling for workspaces, it's polling for work. How does it know that it needs to start polling? It needs to have the configuration.
The
Otherwise, it's not
configuration
polling.
for sure, but the configuration could be a Boolean in this case. It could be just like this agent.
Okay. You're saying on off is just based on whether
Yeah,
it's kind of remote workspaces, empty braces,
true.
like, nothing
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever. And then if that's the case, then it starts polling, and then, yeah, that can work. And for authentication, we just look at only the configuration project and nothing else.
yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
I think that's cool. I think this is what we've done for CI access actually. Before
Okay.
we've done that.
Thanks.
Work
I think
well.
that this is all that my brain can handle in one go. I'm gonna try to process it. I'm gonna go through the code, and I'll try to ask some more questions async, so we don't have to have a call late in your evening anytime soon.
That's fine. Yeah, feel free to ping me if you have more questions on the issue or Slack. Also, not just directly in the agent channel would be better, so that then anyone can answer questions or learn something. Cool. Thank you. I'll upload this.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. See you next time.
See you.
Bye bye.
Bye.